the most recent 911 study that just came out in Police Quarterly, where we talk about, should we defund the police or not, and what do we know about 911 calls, is really part of a broader group of research projects that are funded by the Arnold Ventures and also by the Department of Justice. And a lot of this work is focused on how police officers spend their time. So how they spend their time answering calls for service, how they spend their time in proactive policing, and with the goal to think about how to most effectively use their time to achieve public safety goals and to more effectively respond to different types of things that people are calling them for. So we're very much interested in a more holistic view of policing, and not just how people are using 911 systems, but what does that mean in the context of how police are spending their time and how they're being effective in the way they spend their time. The first is that 911 calls are voluminous. There are millions and millions of 911 calls that are happening across the US and within jurisdictions. They're concentrated in particular places and amongst certain people that are calling 911 frequently. And I think what's one of the most provocative findings about it is that most 911 calls, which shouldn't be surprising, but most 911 calls are for everyday conflicts or situations that people are having. I think one thing that people were surprised to find out in our study was that only a very small proportion of 911 calls actually have to do with people who are in serious mental distress. And I think there was a public perception by both the police and the public that a lot of calls for service were related to people in mental distress. And across our agencies, on average, about 1.3% of calls for service seem to be related to people in serious mental distress, which ranges between 1% and 4% across the 9 agencies that we studied. Most of the calls that people are calling the police, or most of the events that people are calling the police for, are things like disorders, traffic, the suspicions, arguments that they're having with other people, or other just daily challenges, I would call them. Yes, people call the police for property crimes and for violent crimes. Thankfully, those are in the small minority of calls that the police are receiving. So I think one of the reasons why we carried out this project is because we felt like the defunding, and we wrote the paper, is because we felt like the defunding discussion and debate really needed to be informed by actual information and science. As part of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, that's what we focus on quite a bit, that criminal justice policy needs to be informed by data, science, analysis, and information that is reliably obtained. And so one of the motivations behind this study was really to do that. If people are going to talk about defunding, if they're going to be talking about using alternatives for response to 911, well, what are the police actually spending time on? What are people actually calling the police about? And so I think our study has important implications for defunding because it indicates that if you are going to transfer some of these calls to another organization or agency or nonprofit group, then they're going to have to be prepared to deal with these everyday issues. Some of the calls, a very small percentage of the calls, might be able to be managed better through co-responding units for people in mental distress. But for the vast majority of calls, figuring out what organization or what social service provider or what non-governmental agency or community group is going to respond to those calls, I think is a big implication of the study. I would also add one more thing, and that is that as a scientist, I'm not for or against defunding, but if you do go to an alternative, then I would expect to hold those alternatives to the same scientific standards that we're trying to hold the police in our studies. And that is, when they're doing things, are they effective? Are they fair? What are the consequences of those activities? Will the alternate agency be effective in responding to people's needs? And most importantly, will they do so in a fair and non-discriminatory way? And I think that those are really big open questions that have not been resolved yet. I think that the term transform 911 is a bit, not incorrect, but it's a bit limited in my view. I think 911 calls reflect broader aspects of society, the exchanges between people and some authority or public service organization. And I feel like the challenges are not simply or only inside of a 911 call center or with the police or with the fire department or any other organization that plans to respond to 911 calls. For example, I don't think we can address crime and disorder by focusing only on diverting 911 calls elsewhere. We need to focus on what the police and others are doing, both within the call and also proactively to reduce the probability that somebody is going to even need to call 911 in the future. And we also need to consider investing more heavily in disadvantaged or disenfranchised communities, or even with victims, offenders, substance abuse users, where calls might be concentrated. We have to be realistic. I think people are going to call 911. There will be times in which no other social service provider, except the police or fire, will be able to respond. So I'm all for new ideas, but I also believe we have to try to improve what we currently have now. And that's kind of my approach to thinking about when I'm asked about transforming 911. I think the problems are much deeper and wider than just focusing on the 911 system or the 911 response. I think when we talk about transforming 911, we're more broadly talking about, rethinking or reimagining public safety. What would that look like, right? And I think there's whole conversations, of course, about how we're going to pay for new alternatives, how we're going to have to develop policies and practices, and build organizations and motivate people within those organizations to do what we would expect public safety folks to do. But for a scientist, as somebody who works in the evidence-based crime policy arena, I think what's most important to me is whatever those alternatives are, whatever we develop, that we develop them with good information and good data. And we also think about what are the consequences of those alternatives. Can they also be, or can they be better at being effective, being cost effective and effective in the things that they're doing? What are the consequences of their work? Can they do so in fair and non-discriminatory ways? I think these are all really important questions. As a woman and as a person of color, I'm very concerned about who's going to be responding to my 911 call, right? Or who's going to help me when I need assistance on something that's related to public safety. And I would hold whoever responds to the same standards that they treat me fairly and equally because of who I am, or not respective of who I am. Mm-hmm. Disparities are generated by so many factors. People initially call 911, and those initial calls are can have elements of disparity, discrimination, both in ways that are implicit, that are explicit, or that are just parts of the reality that the caller might be living in. So addressing disparity in criminal justice, I think, is one of the most challenging things that we need to work on as scientists. Figuring out what's causing the disparities, the different factors that cause those disparities, and then how to mitigate them as best as we can, I think will be important. The same applies, the same questions, the same concerns apply to any alternative response, or police or fire or public health response more generally. And so, I don't have an easy answer, a quick answer regarding this one. I think from a criminological point of view, our job is to try to understand factors that cause disparities and to evaluate interventions that might mitigate disparity in our justice system. And those are both very tall orders that people are trying to work on, but we certainly need more research on. The National Academies of Sciences currently is working on a consensus committee that's focused on these issues. And so I would encourage listeners to take a look at some of that work. The Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, we also have a couple of initiatives and webinars where we're trying to look at what does the science say about what can mitigate disparity in the criminal justice system. So yeah, this is hard because you might think of calls not just as a call, a 911 call, but as an event, a situation that begins early on from what potentially caused the event, which may have nothing to do with the police or fire, right? How someone reacts to it, or how others may perceive something and then react to it, and then call the police or 911. That in and of itself can have a large amount of discrimination, disparity, prejudice, bias that goes into whether or not an individual calls or sees something that something else is happening and then calls, right? And then this call lives through a series of decisions. Those decisions are made by the call taker, the dispatcher, the police officer that's responding, maybe other services that respond later on. And those things are determined by a wide array of factors and influences and constraints that are both organizational, that come from our own prejudices, that come from society. And so the creation of disparity in criminal justice is complex. And we know for sure we have to try to mitigate it. So our charge is simple. The problem is figuring out what's the most effective way to do that, right? Again, I think there are a lot of ideas out there about 911 call centers, but we really don't have too much research in this area. And it would be great to see more kind of research and practice partnerships in the 911 space to kind of generate more of that knowledge.